The sound of that slap still rings in my mind like a broken bell that just won't stop. It wasn't just the noise of my own son's hand striking his mother's face that froze my blood that Sunday night. It was what came after. The applause from my daughter-in-law, his laughter, the words that spilled from his mouth like distilled poison. She needs to learn her place. We were all gathered for what seemed like a normal family dinner. Me, my wife Helen, my 33-year-old son Richard, and his wife Linda. The table was set with the same care as always, the food still steaming on the plates. The red wine I had saved for a special occasion served in the crystal glasses we got at our wedding 35 years ago. It all started over a silly argument. Helen had commented that it would be nice if they came over for dinner, more often because she missed having her son at home. A simple, affectionate observation, the kind any mother makes without thinking twice. Richard was looking at his cell phone, completely ignoring the conversation, when Helen asked him to put the device away during the meal. Son, put that phone away. Let's talk a little. Richard looked up with an irritation I had never seen before. Mom, you haven't been the boss of me for a long time. Helen insisted with a nervous smile. I know, honey, but we are family. It would be nice if what Richard stood up from his chair with sudden violence. If I did everything you wanted, if I was the obedient little boy you still think I am. I started to get uncomfortable with his tone, but I still thought it was just a moment of stress. Richard had always been a bit temperamental, but he had never crossed basic lines of respect. Helen tried to calm him down, reaching out her hand toward him. Son, And then it happened. Richard raised his right hand and delivered a dry slap across his own mother's face. The noise echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Helen immediately brought her hand to her face, her eyes filling with tears of pain and disbelief. I felt my heart stop for a few seconds, but the worst was yet to come. Linda, who until then had been silent, started to clap. Real applause, like someone watching a successful show. Her clapping sounded obscene in that atmosphere charged with tension and shock. Richard smiled at his wife as if he had just received the approval he was looking for. She needs to learn her place, he said, running his hand through his hair with a gesture of satisfaction. Helen began to cry softly still with her hand on her face, looking at her son as if she couldn't recognize who was standing in front of her. That 33-year-old man she had raised with so much love, who she had rocked in her arms when he cried, who she had taught to ride a bike and helped with schoolwork, was the same man who had just physically assaulted her, and he was still proud of the act. I remained seated for a few seconds that seemed eternal, trying to process what had happened. My mind was working like a slow computer, organizing information that refused to make sense. My son had hit his own mother. My daughter-in-law had applauded the aggression. And there we were around the table that had so often been the scene of family celebrations, living a nightmare in real time. How many fathers have gone through this moment, that exact instant, when you realize you raised a stranger, someone capable of violence against the person he should protect the most? How many men have felt the crushing weight of discovering they failed as fathers in a way they never imagined possible? The pain in my chest was physical, as if someone had stuck a knife between my ribs and was twisting it slowly. My breathing became heavy and irregular. My hands started to shake. It wasn't just anger I was feeling. It was a complex mix of fury, disappointment, guilt, and a type of sadness I had never experienced before. Helen continued crying in silence as if she was afraid of making too much noise and provoking another attack. Linda had stopped clapping but kept a satisfied smile on her face, as if she had finally seen the education she always thought Helen needed to receive. Richard went back to looking at his cell phone as if nothing had happened. It was then that something inside me broke permanently. I got up from the chair in silence without knocking anything over, without making a scene. My movements were deliberate, controlled, but charged with a determination I didn't know I possessed. I walked to the sideboard where we kept the landline and picked it up calmly. Richard looked at me with contempt. "What are you going to do, old man? Call the police on your own son?" I didn't answer. I dialed the number I had memorized years ago but had never used. On the other end of the line, a professional and competent voice answered on the second ring. "Hello, I need to report domestic assault," I said with a firm voice. My son just physically assaulted his own mother, in my presence. The silence that fell over the table was different from all the others. It was a silence charged with shock, with disbelief, with fear. Richard dropped his cell phone and stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Linda stopped smiling. Helen raised her head surprised. "Now let's see who needs to learn." That was all I managed to say before hearing the sound that would change our lives forever. The doorknob began to turn. If you have ever felt that a lifetime of work as a father was worth less than a moment of absolute disrespect, stay with me until the end of this story. Because what happened after that call taught me that a man only loses authority when he accepts being disrespected, not when he enforces his limits. Subscribe to William's Revenge Stories so you don't miss the next reports of men who decide I had to fight back. Before continuing, if you like real stories like this one that show it is never too late for a father to reclaim his place, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Here I don't tell stories of victims. I tell stories of men who chose their dignity over family comfort. My name is Edward. I'm 62 years old and a retired civil engineer. I spent 38 years working on heavy construction sites, getting up before the sun, coming home with an aching back and calloused hands, always thinking about building something solid for my family. Helen and I married young. She was 22. I was 27. Richard was born 2 years later, and from day one I swore to myself I would be the father I wished I had. My own father was a hard man, the type who didn't show affection easily, but who worked like a dog to keep the house running. He died when I was 35, and one of my biggest frustrations was never managing to have a truly close conversation with him. I decided it would be different with Richard. I would be present, affectionate, a friend as well as a father. During his childhood, I think I succeeded. I remember entire afternoons teaching him to play football, in the backyard nights when we stayed up putting puzzles together, on the living room table, weekends, when I took him fishing at the river, about 30 miles from our city. Richard was a sweet boy, intelligent, curious. He asked questions about everything. He wanted to understand how things worked. He dreamed of being an engineer like his dad. Helen was always a dedicated mother, too, perhaps even overly protective. I used to joke with her myself. "Woman, you are going to spoil the boy with so much pampering." But deep down, I liked seeing the affection she showed our son. We were a happy family, or at least that was what I believed at the time. When Richard entered adolescence, things started to change subtly. Nothing dramatic, just the normal adjustments every family goes through. He became more rebellious, more questioning, less interested in spending time with us. I understood that was part of growing up. Helen suffered more. She missed the closeness she had with him as a child, but I always reassured her, "It is just a phase, honey. Every teenager is like this." During high school, Richard started dating a girl from school. Linda was pretty. She came from a family with more money than ours, and from the beginning, she seemed a bit arrogant to me. But Richard was in love, and I respected his choice. Helen tried to get close to the girl, invited her to eat with us on Sundays, asked about her studies, took an interest in her life. Linda always answered politely, but I sensed a coldness, a distance that she never managed to break. When Richard finished high school, I expected him to pursue engineering like he had always said he wanted. But he surprised me by announcing he would study business administration. "The future is in business, Dad. Engineering is a thing of the past." I felt disappointed, but I didn't show it. A father shouldn't impose his dreams on his children, I thought. The important thing was that he went to college. During his college years, Richard started to change in a way I couldn't identify at the time. He became more materialistic, more concerned with brands, with status, with appearances. He started criticizing our house, saying it was small, that the neighborhood wasn't good enough, that we needed to upgrade. Helen was hurt by those comments, but I always defended our son. He is learning to dream big, honey. That is a good thing. When Richard and Linda got married 5 years ago, I spent my savings to help with the party. It was a wedding, expensive in an elegant hall they chose with more than 200 guests. The gift registry was full of items that cost more than I earned in a month. But I wanted my son to be happy, and if happiness for him meant that party, I would make the sacrifice. After the wedding visits to our house became rarer, Richard and Linda lived in an apartment downtown, and there was always an excuse not to come on Sundays. Work commitments, social events trips. Helen missed him. She called constantly to know how they were sent food, offered help with anything. I sensed she was trying too hard to maintain a closeness that no longer existed naturally. In the last 2 years, I started noticing more subtle changes in Richard's behavior toward his mother. When she called, he got impatient. When she asked questions about his life, he answered rudely. When she offered food or help, he treated her as if she were an inconvenience. I talked to Helen about this. You are being a little clingy, honey. Give him space to breathe. But Helen couldn't pull away. Richard was her only son, the center of her world for 33 years. She had dedicated her entire life to taking care of him, and now she didn't know how to fill the void his independence had created. I understood her pain, but I also considered it natural for a married man to want his privacy. What I didn't realize was that Richard's impatience was transforming into something much more sinister. What I interpreted as a desire for independence was actually the construction of a mentality of superiority, constantly fueled by Linda, who had always seemed resentful of the attention Helen gave her son. Linda came from a family where relationships were colder, more distant. Her mother was a successful businesswoman who outsourced almost all child-rearing to nannies and private schools. For Linda, Helen's dedication was excessive, unnecessary, even irritating, and she started planting those ideas in my son's head. Without me knowing, my daughter-in-law was poisoning my son against his own mother. Seemingly innocent comments. Your mom is very clingy, isn't she? Doesn't she have other interests besides you? My mom was never like that. She always respected my space. A woman her age should have her own life. Richard, who had always been close to his mother, began to see that closeness through his wife's eyes. What was once love and care was now interpreted as invasion and dependence. What was once affection was now seen as suffocation. And worst of all, he started thinking he had the right, maybe even the obligation to educate his mother so she would learn her place. I was blinded by paternal love and by the trust I always had in my son's character, so I didn't see any of this. I saw only a young adult trying to establish his independence, something I considered natural and even healthy. When Helen complained about his rude manners, I always asked her for patience. He is going through an adjustment phase, honey. It will pass soon. But that night when I saw my own son's hand cross the face of the woman who raised him with so much love, when I heard my daughter-in-law's applause, celebrating the aggression, when I saw Helen crying in pain and humiliation at the table, that was so often the scene of our family happiness, I understood with brutal clarity that I hadn't just been blind. I had been an accomplice. For years I allowed small disrespects to accumulate. For years I justified the unjustifiable. For years I asked Helen to accept less and less dignity, believing that was giving the son space to grow. That call I made wasn't just to report an assault. It was to admit my own failure as a father and a husband, and to do the only thing I could still do. Protect the woman I loved from the monster I had helped create. There are silences from a father that weigh more than screams. There is blindness that hurts more than any slap. While I waited for the authorities to arrive, sitting at that destroyed table, my mind began to replay, like a movie in slow motion, all the signs I had ignored over the years. The first episode that should have alerted me happened 2 years ago at Christmas. Helen had struggled for weeks to prepare the perfect dinner. She bought the best ingredients our budget allowed. She decorated the house. She prepared all of Richard's favorite dishes. When they arrived an hour late, Richard looked at the table and said, "Mom, you exaggerated again. Linda is on a diet. She doesn't eat this heavy stuff." Helen, visibly hurt, offered to prepare something lighter. Richard rolled his eyes. "Leave it, don't bother." The tone was of someone speaking to an annoying child, not to the mother who had spent all day cooking for him. I should have intervened at that moment. I should have pulled my son aside and explained that was no way to treat his mother. But I didn't. I thought, "It is stress from work, from the holiday rush. He will apologize tomorrow." He never apologized. A few weeks later, Helen called Richard to tell him she had felt sick and had gone to the ER alone because I was traveling for work. It was just a blood pressure spike. Nothing serious, but she was scared and wanted her son's support. Richard listened to everything with impatience and at the end said, "Mom, you have to stop dramatizing these things. It was just a headache." Helen cried after the call. I tried to console her. "He didn't mean it in a bad way, honey. Men express worry differently." Once again, I played the role of translator, justifying the unjustifiable. The pattern repeated several times. Richard started treating any manifestation of affection or concern from his mother as neurosis, as exaggeration, as something inconvenient that needed to be contained. And Linda always reinforced that stance with seemingly innocent comments. "It is true, Helen, you have to take care of yourself more, not worry so much about others." During the Mother's Day lunch, Helen commented that she wished Richard would call more often, that she missed talking to him. Richard sighed loudly as if she were asking for something absurd and said, "Mom, I have my own life. I can't be calling all the time just to chat." The harshness of the answer left Helen quiet for the rest of the afternoon. Linda took advantage of the awkward silence to comment, "It is just that you guys from Helen's generation are more dependent. Nowadays, children are more independent." The comment sounded like a psychological explanation, but it was pure poison disguised as understanding. I also started noticing that Richard only sought contact with us when he needed something. When his car broke down, he called to borrow mine. When they wanted to change apartments, he came to talk about a loan for the down payment. When Linda wanted to take an expensive course, he suggested Helen help with the costs, since she didn't have many expenses anyway. Every request for financial help came accompanied by a subtle humiliation. "Dad, you guys don't use that money anyway," or "Mom, it would be a way for you to participate in our life," as if our hard-earned money was a bargaining chip for attention. Helen always agreed to help Happy to feel useful, to have a reason to be in her son's life. I sensed she was being manipulated, but I allowed it because I also wanted to keep Richard close, even if it was through financial favors. The final straw financially should have been when Richard borrowed the car I had bought for Helen, promising to return it in a week. The car stayed with them for 2 months. When they finally returned it, it had a scratch on the side and an empty tank. Richard didn't mention the damage, much less offer to repair it. When Helen delicately asked about the scratch, Richard answered with irritation, "It was an accident in the parking lot, Mom. What do you want me to do?" These things happen. The coldness with which he treated her well-being, the total lack of responsibility, should have been my limit, but I kept justifying. "It is just a scratch, honey. The important thing is no one got hurt." Richard's behavior toward our values also changed drastically. He started making derogatory comments about our house, our neighborhood, our lifestyle. "Dad, you guys should think about moving to a better place," or "This house is looking old. It is time for an update." Linda always added, "It is true, Edward. You deserve something more modern, more fitting with what you achieved." It seemed like concern, but it was depreciation in disguise. When Helen got excited, talking about some soap opera she was watching or some new recipe she had learned, Richard interrupted her with impatience. "Mom, don't you have more interesting topics? Or worse, you should get something to do instead of watching that nonsense." Linda was always ready to explain her husband's behavior. "Oh, Helen, It is just that Richard works with very cultured people, right? Sometimes it is difficult for him to adapt to simpler conversations. The comment was a dagger wrapped in silk. Helen started to censor herself to be afraid to talk about her interests, to feel inferior in the presence of her own son. I saw her self-esteem being slowly corroded, but I couldn't identify exactly how this was happening. What hurts me most to remember are the occasions when Richard simply ignored his mother. During family conversations, he answered only what I said, as if Helen were invisible. When she asked a question, he answered, looking at me, as if her words didn't deserve direct attention. On her 60th birthday, Helen struggled to organize a special lunch. She bought expensive ingredients, prepared elaborate dishes, decorated the table. Richard arrived 2 hours late, ate quickly without praising anything, and left right after dessert, saying he had important commitments. Helen spent the rest of the day putting away the food she had prepared for a party that never happened. That night, I found her crying in the kitchen. "I think I'm losing my son," she said between sobs. I don't know what I did wrong. I consoled her as always. "You didn't do anything wrong, honey. Richard is just going through a phase. He still loves you very much." But deep down, I was also starting to suspect that something was very wrong. The coldness, the disguised contempt, the total lack of consideration for his mother's feelings. None of that was normal, even for an adult wanting to establish independence. Are there many fathers living this silent denial? How many men know something is wrong, but prefer to believe it is just a phase instead of facing the reality that they failed in raising their children? The episode that should have been my definitive awakening happened 6 months ago. Helen had a severe anxiety attack, something that had never happened before. We had to take her to the hospital. I called Richard immediately, explaining his mother was sick and we needed him. "Is it serious?" he asked with the tone of someone being interrupted during something important. "She is having trouble breathing. She is very agitated," I explained. "Dad, those women things are usually psychological. It is nothing serious. If it is really serious, call me later." He hung up. He didn't show up at the hospital. He didn't call to know how she was. When Helen was discharged the next day, he sent a message. Good thing it passed. "I told you it wasn't anything serious." At that moment, I should have exploded. I should have gone to his house and had a serious conversation about respect and filial responsibility. I should have set clear limits on the unacceptable behavior that was becoming the norm, but I did nothing. I kept justifying. I kept asking Helen to have patience. I kept believing that deep down he was still the sweet boy I had raised. Now, sitting at that table, waiting for the police, I had called myself, I understood, with painful clarity, that all those episodes hadn't been isolated signs. They were steps on a downward staircase leading directly to that slap on the face of the woman who had dedicated her entire life to his well-being. And I had climbed every step along with him, carrying him on the shoulders of my own denial. There is a specific loneliness of a man who raised children who later became strangers. It is a pain that has no name, a sense of failure that corrodes from the inside like rust on exposed metal. While we waited for the authorities to arrive, I looked at Helen still holding her face and realized my blindness hadn't just been ignorance. It had been cowardice. For years, Richard developed a subtle but efficient system of emotional and financial exploitation that I only managed to see completely that night. It wasn't just the requests for borrowed money that never came back or the favors that became obligations. It was a whole method to make Helen feel grateful for crumbs of attention while he and Linda extracted everything they needed from her. I remember now with a clarity that hurts in my bones how Richard had become a master at manipulating Helen's maternal feelings. He knew exactly when to show up with a smile and affectionate conversation, always after being especially rude, always when he needed something. "Mom, I love you, right?" he would tell her after weeks without calling. "It is just that work is heavy, but you were always the most important woman in my life." Helen melted with those words, instantly forgot accumulated resentments, and was ready to grant any request that came after. And a request always came. By the way, Mom Linda was commenting that you guys could help us with the rent on the apartment this month. Just this once. Next month, I will settle everything with you. Helen opened her wallet without blinking, happy to be able to help her son to feel useful in his life. I perceived the pattern, but when I commented on something, Helen always defended him. Edward is going through difficulties. He is our son. We have to support him. And I, not wanting to be the executioner father, not wanting to be seen as insensitive, ended up agreeing. What I didn't understand at that time was that Richard had learned to use my own kindness against me. He knew I wouldn't manage to deny help to my own son even when I suspected I was being used. And he also knew that Helen would never stop defending him, no matter how badly he treated her. Linda was even more subtle in her cruelty. She developed the art of humiliating Helen through poisoned compliments and seemingly innocent comparisons. "Oh, Helen, you are so dedicated to the family. My mom was never like that. She was always more independent, everyone in their own world." The comment sounded like admiration, but it carried the clear message that Helen was excessively dependent, that there was something wrong with her maternal dedication. Or then, "Helen, you should get a hobby, something just for you. Like my mom does, Pilates travels with friends. It must be nice to have a life of your own, right?" Once again, the criticism came disguised as concern, but the message was clear. Helen had no life of her own. She was an empty person who lived through her son. Helen started to internalize those messages. She started questioning herself if she really was being clingy, if her maternal concern was excessive, if she should give more space to her son. And the more she questioned herself, the more insecure she became, the more desperate for approval. That insecurity made her even more vulnerable to manipulation. Richard learned that it was enough to threaten to pull away for Helen to give in to any demand. "Mom, if you keep pressuring me, I'm going to stop coming here." It was a phrase he used whenever Helen tried to set some limit or express some resentment. The fear of abandonment was stronger than dignity. Helen preferred to accept any treatment rather than run the risk of losing her son permanently. And Richard exploited that fear with the precision of a surgeon. I watched that psychological game without managing to name it, without managing to intervene effectively. As a man, I had been educated to solve practical problems, not to deal with subtle emotional manipulations. When Helen complained about her son's behavior, I offered direct solutions. Then don't lend him any more money, or stop calling so much. But that didn't solve the real problem, which was Richard's sick need for control and superiority. The financial exploitation also followed a cruel pattern. Richard always asked to borrow, never as a donation. This created an illusion that he respected our financial condition, that it was just a temporary difficulty. But the money never came back, and when he was questioned about this, he always had an excuse ready. "Dad, an emergency came up. I had to use the money for something else. But next month, I will settle with you. Or you guys know I am good for it. It is just one more month." Or even, "Wow, I thought that, between family, these things didn't need to be so formal." He had developed the skill of making us seem petty for collecting what was ours by right, as if paternal love should be measured by our willingness to accept financial loss, as if questioning the loans was a lack of trust in the son, and Linda always reinforced that narrative. "Oh, Uncle Edward, Richard always meets his commitments. He is just going through a difficult patch at work." Or, "You guys are so generous. We are very lucky to have a family that supports us." The compliments were hooks to keep us willing to continue supporting, even when the support was transforming into sustaining a lifestyle they couldn't afford alone. What shames me most to remember is how I allowed Helen to be treated like an unpaid employee in their lives. Whenever they needed something, a special meal, washed clothes, a clean house to receive visitors, they called Helen, and she, happy to feel needed, met all the requests. "Mom, can you make that tres leches cake Linda likes? We are going to have some friends over." Helen spent all day cooking, packed everything with care, and they stopped by quickly to pick it up, without even coming in to talk. Helen, don't you want to give us a hand tidying up our apartment? Richard's mom is coming. Linda spoke of Helen as if she wasn't Richard's mother, as if she were just a convenient service provider. Helen accepted everything because every request was proof that she was still important in her son's life. But I should have realized that they didn't see her as a mother and mother-in-law, but as an employee who worked for free in exchange for crumbs of affection. The most painful humiliation I witnessed happened on Helen's birthday 8 months ago. She had commented weeks before that she would like to have dinner all together at a nice restaurant to celebrate her 58th birthday. Richard agreed. He said he would take care of organizing everything. On the day of her birthday, Helen got ready with care. She chose the nicest dress she had. She was radiant with expectation. Richard called in the middle of the afternoon. "Mom, it is going to have to be another day. A work commitment came up that I can't cancel." Helen tried to hide the disappointment. "That is okay, son. We will leave it for the weekend. It is just that on the weekend we are going to travel. Let's leave it for next month." "Okay." The birthday was celebrated just between the two of us at home with a cake I bought at the last minute. "Really?" Helen tried to smile, but I saw the pain in her eyes. "He must be really busy." "Really?" she said more to herself than to me. We discovered later through a photo on Facebook that Richard and Linda had gone to a barbecue at a friend's house that same day. It wasn't a work commitment. It was simply priority. Friends were more important than his mother's birthday. When I confronted Richard about the lie, he answered with irritation, "Dad, you guys make drama over anything. It was just a birthday." We celebrate another day, as if the disrespect was our fault for making drama, not his for lying. This is the type of violence that doesn't leave a visible mark, but goes on corroding the victim's soul, slowly. Helen started accepting less and less, contenting herself with less and less attention, feeling grateful for every crumb of consideration. And I, as a man raised to solve concrete problems, didn't know how to fight that type of subtle cruelty. The exploitation had become so systematic that they created a mental calendar of our resources. They knew when I received my pension, when Helen had some money saved, when we could be triggered for another financial emergency. And I allowed all this because I confused paternal love with complacency, because I confused family support with acceptance of disrespect. How many fathers make this same mistake? How many men confuse being a good father with being an overly permissive father? That night, looking at Helen with her face marked by her own son's slap, I understood that my hesitation in confronting Richard hadn't been wisdom or patience. It had been pure cowardice. Cowardice to face the reality that I had raised a man capable of assaulting his own mother. Cowardice to admit that my permissive raising had produced a monster. But when the doorknob started to turn, I knew the cowardice was over. From that moment on, I would be the father I should have been years ago, firm, protective, and willing to face any consequence to defend the dignity of the woman who had given her life for our son. There are pains a man swallows for years until one day the throat can't take it anymore. The sound of the doorknob turning was like an alarm clock ringing after a nightmare that lasted years. I knew that on the other side of the door was the authority I myself had called, and that nothing would be the same after that moment. Richard watched the door with an expression I had never seen on his face. It was pure fear, the fear of someone who always counted on impunity and suddenly sees himself facing consequences. Linda had stopped smiling and looked alternately at her husband and at me, as if she still couldn't believe I had really called the police. "Dad, you didn't do that," Richard muttered, his voice coming out hoarse. "You didn't call the police on your own son." I didn't answer. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, waiting. Helen was still in shock, her hand on her face, looking at all of us as if she couldn't understand where she was or what was happening. The door opened and 2 police officers entered with firm steps. An older man with a sergeant's badge and a young woman, both with professional, serious expressions. It wasn't the first time they answered a domestic violence call. That was clear in the way they quickly assessed the scene. "Good evening. We received a call about domestic assault at this address," said the sergeant, looking at each of us. "Who made the call?" I stood up slowly. It was me. My son physically assaulted his own mother in my presence. Richard jumped up. "Dad, this is a misunderstanding. It wasn't anything like that." The police looked at Helen, who was still seated, clearly shaken. "Ma'am, were you assaulted?" Helen looked at Richard with an expression of deep pain, then at me, then at the police officers. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny everything like so many women do out of fear or not wanting to harm the aggressor. But then she spoke with a low but firm voice. "Yes. My son slapped me in the face." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard went pale as paper. Linda looked at him with an expression of panic. "That is not true," shouted Richard. "She is confused. It was just a family argument." The sergeant looked at him sternly. "Sir, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you." The reality of the situation began to hit Richard hard. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Dad, how can you do this to me? I am your son." That phrase, "I am your son," hit me like a punch in the stomach. During Richard's entire life, I had used that phrase as justification to forgive anything, to accept any disrespect, to overlook any mistake. "He is my son," I told Helen when she complained about his behavior. "He is my son," I repeated to myself when something bothered me. But at that moment, looking at Helen with her face marked by the blow, I understood that being a father didn't mean accepting everything from the son. It meant protecting what was right, even when it hurt. It meant being the moral authority of the family, even when it cost the relationship. "Yes, you are my son," I answered with a firm voice. "And because of that, you of all people should know not to hit your mother." The police officers started taking statements. Helen recounted in detail what had happened, her voice trembling but determined. I confirmed everything, explaining I had witnessed the assault and Linda's applause. The police noted everything carefully. When it was Richard's turn, he tried to minimize. "It was just an impulse. I was nervous. It wasn't anything serious." "Sir," said the sergeant, "physical aggression against a family member is a crime." Regardless of the intensity and based on the witness's account, there was also humiliation of the victim. Linda, who had been quiet until then, decided to speak. "Officers, I think you are exaggerating. It was just a little family spat. These things happen." The police stared at her seriously. "Did you applaud when your husband assaulted your mother-in-law?" Linda turned red. I didn't. It was a misunderstanding." "Do you consider it normal to applaud domestic violence?" Linda didn't know what to answer. After taking all statements, the police explained that Richard would be taken to the station for formal booking. Depending on the prosecutor on duty, he could be held until the custody hearing. "Dad, please," Richard implored when the police approached him. "Don't let this happen. I am an engineer. I have a reputation to protect. This is going to destroy my career." I looked at him for a long moment. All my life I had protected Richard from the consequences of his acts. When he broke something at school, I paid. When he got into trouble, I fixed it. When he disrespected someone, I apologized on his behalf. I always found a way to protect him from the consequences, believing that was paternal love. But that night, looking at Helen still trembling with fear, I understood that protecting Richard from the consequences of his acts had been the worst thing I could have done as a father. I had raised a man who felt entitled to assault without consequences because he had never faced any. "Richard," I said with a heavy voice, "you destroyed your own career when you raised your hand against your mother." The police led him out. He shouted that this was an injustice, that I would regret it, that he would never forgive me. Linda followed him, crying and insulting all of us. When the door closed, the house fell silent. Helen and I were left alone in the dining room with the plates still on the table, with the food getting cold, with the pieces of our family scattered on the floor. Helen looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't anger, it wasn't gratitude. It was a mixture of relief and deep sadness. "Edward," she said softly, "thank you." I hugged her, feeling her body tremble against mine. "Helen, forgive me for taking so long to do this." She cried on my shoulder, a long cry of years of accumulated pain, finally being released. And I cried too, not just for her pain, but for the loss of the son I thought I had raised. That night, after Helen finally managed to sleep, I stayed awake in the living room, looking at the table where it had all happened. I realized that call to the police hadn't just been to protect Helen. It had been my last chance to be truly a father. In the following days, I had to face the reality of my decisions. Richard was released after the custody hearing, but with a restraining order preventing any contact with us. He tried to call several times, sent messages, even showed up on our street, but the police always sent him away. Linda called, once hysterical, saying I had destroyed their marriage, that Richard was desperate that I was an unnatural father. I hung up the phone in the middle of the conversation. Neighbors commented, some with discreet support, others with silent judgment. I didn't care. For the first time in years, I was sleeping with a clear conscience. Helen took weeks to come out of the state of shock. She spent hours sitting on the porch, staring at nothing, as if she were still processing what had happened. I respected her. Silence stayed close without pressuring. "Edward," she asked me one morning, "do you think I did something wrong for him to turn out like this? Helen, you dedicated your life to that boy you gave love. Care, attention, you sacrificed your own dreams. If he became what he became, it wasn't your fault. Then why does he hate me so much? He doesn't hate you. Helen, he despises you, and that is worse because hate is still an intense feeling. Contempt is total indifference for the person's value." Little by little, Helen started to recover. Not completely. Some wounds never heal completely, but enough to live again. She started going out more, talking to neighbors, taking care of the garden she had abandoned. I also changed. I stopped justifying the unjustifiable, stopped pitying Richard. I understood that being a father doesn't mean accepting anything from the son, but teaching limits, even if it is too late. 3 months after the episode, Richard tried an approach through a mutual acquaintance. He sent word that he wanted to talk, that he was sorry, that he wanted to ask for forgiveness. Helen hesitated. "Do you think we should give him a chance?" I thought, long before answering. "Helen, he's only sorry because he faced consequences. For years he disrespected you without any consequence, and the disrespect only increased. If we back down now, he is going to understand that he can assault, because in the end, we always forgive. But he is our son, Edward, exactly. And as our son, he needs to learn that some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. We decided to maintain the distance, not out of revenge, but for protection. Protection for Helen, who was learning to live without fear. Protection for our dignity, which was being rebuilt slowly. And protection for Richard himself, who needed to understand that being a son wasn't a blank check to assault the one who loved him most. When a father is betrayed by his own blood, the scar crosses generations. But sometimes it is necessary for the truth to hurt more than silence for healing to be possible. In the months that followed that transforming night, I followed closely how Richard and Linda's life began to crumble brick by brick, consequence by consequence. The first thing that happened was Richard lost his job. The company where he worked had a strict policy regarding employees involved in domestic violence cases. When Human Resources found out about the restraining order, because these things always leak in small towns, he was invited to resign voluntarily to preserve the company's image. Linda called Helen, crying, begging her to withdraw the complaint. "Helen, you don't understand. Richard lost his job. How are we going to pay the bills?" Helen, who before melted, with any tear related to her son, this time maintained a firmness I had never seen in her. "Linda, he lost his job because he hit me. The consequences are his responsibility. But it was just a little slap, Helen. You are exaggerating." A little slap, Helen repeated, her voice coming out firmer. "Linda, you applauded when your husband assaulted me, And now you want me to feel sorry for him?" The silence on the other end of the line was long. Linda hung up without answering. Without Richard's salary, they couldn't keep the apartment downtown. In 2 weeks, they were already behind on rent. In a month, they received an eviction notice. They had to move to a smaller, cheaper place in a neighborhood Linda had always criticized when she visited our house. The irony was bitter. She had always said our neighborhood was too simple for them. Now they were living in an even simpler place. Richard tried some temporary jobs, but his reputation had spread. In a small town, everyone knows everyone, and news of a man who assaulted his own mother circulates fast. Some employers didn't even give him a chance. Others fired him after a few days, always with polite excuses about staff reduction or profile incompatibility. One afternoon I ran into Richard downtown. He was coming out of a store where he had apparently tried to apply for a vacancy. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, his posture totally different from that arrogant man who had hit his mother months before. When he saw me, he stopped. For a moment I thought he was going to approach, try to talk, but he just stood there looking at me with an expression that mixed anger, shame, and something that could be regret. I also stopped returning the gaze. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anger. I felt only a deep sadness for the man he could have been, and chose not to be. He lowered his head and went on his way. Their economic situation deteriorated rapidly. Richard had always been the type who spent everything he earned and a little more. Without a fixed job with poorly paid sporadic work, soon they started facing real difficulties. Linda, who had always boasted about her designer clothes and her hair impeccably done at the most expensive salon in the city, now appeared on the street with the same dress repeated several times, her hair cut anywhere, her nails without polish. The most dramatic transformation, however, was in the dynamic of their relationship. When Richard had money and status, Linda admired him, supported him, encouraged him in all his attitudes, including the disrespect toward us. But now seeing him unemployed, defeated, dependent on her to get the temporary jobs that appeared, she started showing what she really thought of him. "Richard, you should have controlled your temper," I heard her say once when they passed our street. "Now look at the situation you created for us." "Linda, this wasn't supposed to happen," he answered with a tired voice. "Wasn't supposed to happen, Richard. You hit your mom in front of your dad. What did you expect to happen?" It was interesting to observe how Linda, who had applauded the aggression, now spoke as if she had always been against it. Memory is a convenient thing when convenience is necessary for survival, but the hardest blow for Richard was yet to come. The company where he had worked for 5 years decided to sue him for breach of contract. Apparently there were moral clauses in the contract that allowed that action when the employee got involved in activities that harmed the company. They wanted back part of the benefits that had been paid, including the car that was in the company's name, but that Richard used as if it were his. When we found out about this through mutual acquaintances, Helen was shocked. "Edward, can they do that?" "They can, Helen, and they are doing it." Richard tried to hire a lawyer to defend himself, but lawyers cost money, and he didn't have any. He ended up accepting a settlement that left him with considerable debt and without any of the assets he thought were his. Linda couldn't handle the pressure. 3 months after Richard lost his job, she communicated she was separating. "This wasn't what I signed up for when I got married," she told a mutual neighbor who later told Helen. "I married a successful man, not a violent, unemployed guy." The hypocrisy was impressive. She had encouraged and applauded the violence when Richard had money. Now that he was broke, the same violence became unacceptable. Richard despaired with the separation. He called Helen for the first time in months, crying on the phone, begging her to intercede with Linda. "Mom, please talk to Linda. She can't leave me now. I need her." Helen held the phone with her hands trembling slightly, but her voice came out firm. "Richard, you chose to hit me in front of her," she applauded. "You two showed what kind of people you are. Now you two solve your problems. Mom, I was nervous that day. I didn't mean to. Richard, do you want me to pity you because your wife is abandoning you? You who abandoned me emotionally for years. You who only called when you needed money. You who treated me like an employee. The silence on the other end of the line was long. Richard Helen continued, her voice becoming firmer with every word. For years I begged for a little affection from you, for a little respect, for a little consideration. You gave me slaps and humiliations. Now you are begging for affection from Linda, for respect, for consideration, and she is giving you abandonment. Maybe now you understand how I felt during all those years. Richard hung up without answering. The separation was finalized quickly. Linda kept the apartment, which was in her name, and most of the assets. Richard was left with some clothes, some old furniture, and a considerable debt. He tried to move back in with Linda's parents, but they, who had always treated him politely for their daughter's sake, now made it clear he wasn't welcome. Richard, you brought disgrace to our family, Linda's father told him as I was told. It is better that you go on with your life far from our daughter. Richard ended up renting a small room in a boarding house in the cheapest neighborhood in the city. The man who had considered our house too small now lived in a space the size of our bathroom. One night Helen saw him walking down the street where the boarding house is located. She had gone to pick up medicine at the 24-hour pharmacy and ended up passing by there. Richard was returning from work. He had gotten a job as a salesman in an auto parts store with a styrofoam container in his hands and an expression of deep fatigue on his face. When Helen told me, I sensed she was emotionally moved by having seen her son in that situation, Edward. Do you think we did the right thing? I hugged her slowly. Helen, we didn't do anything. He did, we just stopped accepting. But he is suffering. He is living the consequences of his decisions. For years the one suffering was you, in silence without him caring. Now he is learning what it is to suffer for real. Helen cried that night, but it wasn't the cry of a victim anymore. It was the conflicted cry of a mother who loves her son, but who finally understood the difference between loving someone and accepting being mistreated by that person. Richard tried one last time a direct approach. He appeared at our door one Sunday morning, skinny with clothes that seemed too big, eyes sunken with fatigue. Dad, I need to talk to you guys. I didn't open the gate. Richard, you have a restraining order. You can't be here. Dad, please, I just want to apologize. I learned my lesson. Helen appeared behind me. When she saw her son in that state, her eyes filled with tears. Mom, Richard said, his voice breaking, Forgive me. I was wrong. I never should have raised my hand against you. I was going through problems. I was stressed. But that doesn't justify anything. Helen looked at me, asking for silent guidance. I knew she wanted to open her arms and hug that broken man who was on the other side of the gate. But I also knew it wasn't genuine repentance we were seeing. It was desperation. Richard, I said calmly, where was that repentance when you still had a job? Where was it when you were still married? Where was it when you still had a comfortable life at the expense of disrespecting your mother? He lowered his head. You are only sorry now because you lost everything, not because you finally understood the harm you did to your mother. If your life improves tomorrow, you will go back to treating us badly. No, Dad, I swear no. Richard, for years you swore you respected your mother. For years you promised you would visit. More, for years you said you would pay back the borrowed money. Your promises are worth nothing. Richard started crying right there on the sidewalk like a child. But it wasn't the tear of someone who recognizes his mistakes. It was the tear of someone lamenting the consequences of those mistakes. So you are going to abandon me. I am your son. No, Richard, we are going to protect ourselves from you as we should have done years ago. I closed the door and took Helen inside. She cried a lot that day, but she didn't give in. Weeks later, we learned that Richard had left the city. He couldn't get a decent job. He didn't have friends. Everyone pulled away after the scandal, and he lived a miserable life in that boarding house. He decided to try to start over somewhere else. Linda also moved. She went to a bigger city with an aunt. Before leaving, she came to say goodbye to Helen, which was a surprise and said something I will never forget. Aunt Helen, I know you must hate me, but I want you to know that I always envied you. Helen was confused. Envy. Why? Because Richard always loved you more than me. I tried for years to make him choose between you and me, and he never chose. Even when he mistreated you, even when he was rude, he still called when you got sick, he still worried. I wanted him to love me that way. Helen remained silent. That is why I applauded when he hit you. Not because I thought it was right, but because finally he had done something that I knew you would never forgive. Finally, I had won. And what did you win? Linda, nothing, she answered, starting to cry. I won a man who hits his mom, and a man who hits his own mother at some point also hits his wife. That confession revealed what I always suspected. The evil hadn't been just Richard's. Linda had been the architect of our family's destruction, using my son's emotional weakness to satisfy her own sick need for control. After the departure of the two, Helen's life and mine changed completely. We stopped living in fear of the phone ringing. We stopped worrying about requests for money. We stopped accepting crumbs of attention disguised as filial love. The house became quieter, but it was a silence of peace, not abandonment. The same man who carried his son on his shoulders one day finds himself without ground to stand on. But sometimes it is necessary to lose the son you imagined you raised to find the man you really are. In the months that followed Richard and Linda's departure, Helen and I discovered something we had forgotten for decades, what it was like to live without fear. The first days were strange. Helen woke up startled when the phone rang, still expecting to hear Richard's voice on the other end of the line, with some urgent request or some disguised complaint. I caught myself checking bank accounts more frequently still, with the paranoia of discovering some check he had managed to cash without our authorization. But little by little, the tension gave way to something we hadn't felt for years: tranquility. The first change we made was simple but symbolic. Helen wanted to change the dining room table, the one where everything had happened. I can't eat at it without remembering, she said one day, looking at the piece of furniture as if it carried a curse. We sold the old table and bought a new one, smaller, just for the two of us. The first meal we had at it was a simple Sunday lunch. Rice, beans, a roast chicken Helen made with care. We ate slowly, talking about trivialities, without rushing, without tension. You know what Edward Helen said halfway through dessert? I haven't tasted food for real in years. I always ate with fear that Richard would arrive and criticize something. I understood exactly what she meant. For years, every meal had been a performance, an attempt to please someone who didn't want to be pleased. Helen started rediscovering tastes she had abandoned. She went back to watching her soap operas without guilt, without feeling obligated to change the channel when Richard arrived with derogatory comments about that nonsense. She went back to cooking dishes she liked instead of only what he liked. She went back to wearing colorful clothes he always criticized for being exaggerated for her age. I also went through a transformation. For years my life had revolved around justifying and remedying the problems created by Richard. Now, suddenly, I had mental energy for other things. I went back to reading a habit I had abandoned because I was always worried about Richard's financial emergencies. I started taking better care of the garden, something I always liked doing but had neglected. I reconnected with friends I had lost over the years because I was always busy being a good father, or rather being a permissive father. One afternoon I ran into my old coworker Mark at the supermarket. We hadn't spoken in more than a year. Edward, how are you? And Richard, I heard some comments around, but you know how it is, small town gossip. I could have lied, created a softened version of the story, but I decided to be honest. Mark Richard assaulted his own mother. I called the police. He moved out of town. We don't have contact anymore. Mark was silent for a few seconds, clearly not expecting such a direct answer. Edward, hoy! I don't know what to say. It must have been very difficult. It was, but it was the right thing. Mark looked at me with something that could be admiration. Man, I don't know if I would have the courage to call the police on my own son. That is exactly why I called him Mark, because it was the hardest thing to do. That conversation made me realize something important. Not being afraid to tell the truth is liberating. For years I had hidden the problems. From Richard. Created edited versions of events to protect his image. Now talking about what had happened without trying to soften or justify made me feel lighter. Helen also started talking openly about the situation. When neighbors asked about Richard, she answered bluntly, "He assaulted me. We don't have contact anymore." At first this caused surprise and comments, but soon Helen realized that many women her age lived similar situations, with disrespectful children only in silence. Mrs. Helen, a neighbor, told her one day, "I admire your courage. My son also treats me badly, but I would never have the courage to do what you did." Mrs. Mary Helen answered, "Courage isn't in facing the sun. Courage is in stopping accepting being mistreated." Those chats helped Helen understand she wasn't an isolated case, that there were many mothers suffering in silence with ungrateful children, but at the same time she realized she had done something. Few do. She had set limits. We decided to make some practical changes in life. Helen always wanted to have a dog, but Richard was allergic, and whenever she suggested it, he reacted as if she were proposing something absurd. Mom dogs are work, they dirty the house, they cost money. Why complicate things? One day, passing in front of an animal shelter, we saw an adoption ad. Helen stopped and stood looking at a medium-sized mongrel with sad eyes and brown fur. "Edward, what do you think, Helen, if you want him?" "We adopt him. The house is ours, the life is ours." We adopted the dog that same day. Helen named him Buddy. It was interesting to see how having an animal at home changed the dynamic of our days. Buddy needed care, affection, attention. But unlike the care we gave Richard, this was returned, with genuine gratitude, with affection, with loyalty. "You know," Edward Helen said one day, petting Buddy, "this dog gives me more affection in one day than Richard gave me in the last 5 years." The statement was sad, but true. Helen also decided to go back to studying. She had always wanted to finish the teaching degree she had abandoned when Richard was born, but there was never time. There was always a family emergency preventing it. At 58, she enrolled in the local university to finish the 2 years she lacked. "Helen, are you sure it is going to be heavy? Studying at this age." "Edward, for 33 years, I educated my son. Now I want to learn to educate other children the right way." Seeing her coming home with books under her arms, studying at the kitchen table, doing group work with classmates 30 years younger, was one of the most beautiful things I witnessed in our life together. Helen had found a purpose that didn't depend on being a mother. I also made changes. I always wanted to learn guitar, but there was never time. With Richard married and apparently independent, I had thought about starting, but some crisis of his always appeared absorbing my energy. Now finally, I enrolled in a music course for seniors. I discovered I had a knack for the instrument. In a few months, I could already play some simple songs. Helen loved listening to me practice on the porch at the end of the afternoon. Sometimes we sang together songs we liked when we were young. "Remember when we sang these songs at the beginning of our dating?" Helen said one day, listening to me play. I remember we stopped singing when Richard was born. Did we stop doing a lot of things when he was born? We thought about that it was true. Over the years, we had given up hobbies, friends, interests, always in the name of family, always prioritizing Richard's needs. And when he grew up, instead of resuming our life, we started living according to his problems. We decided to make a list of things we wanted to do and never did. Helen wanted to see the sea we had never traveled because Richard always needed something. I wanted to visit museums in other cities. We both wanted to have more time with friends. Our first trip was simple, a weekend at the beach, 2 hours from home. Helen got emotional when she saw the ocean for the first time at 58. Edward. What fools we were never to have done this before. It is never too late, Helen. She took off her shoes and walked on the wet sand like a girl. I photographed her with my cell phone, smiling with a joy I hadn't seen in years. In that photo, she doesn't look like a 58-year-old woman. Burdened with frustrations, she looks like a free woman. We started traveling regularly, nothing extravagant, simple weekend trips. But every trip was a reconquest of something we had lost. The capacity to have fun together, to discover new things, to live the present instead of always worrying about Richard's problems. Our relationship also changed. For years, all our conversations revolved around him. What had he done? What did he need? How to help him? How to interpret him? Now we talked about us, about our plans, about feelings. Edward Helen said one night lying in bed, "I feel like I'm getting to know you again." "What do you mean?" "For years you were just Richard's dad to me, the man who helped me solve his problems, who consoled me when he hurt me. Now you are my husband again." That observation touched me deeply. It was true. We two had become hostages of the sick dynamic Richard had created. Helen graduated in pedagogy at 60. The graduation ceremony was emotional. I was proud of her in a way I had never felt proud of Richard, even in his best moments. The pride I felt for her was clean, without reservations, without buts. "Edward, thank you for supporting me these 2 years. Helen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to support you." After graduation, Helen got a job at a municipal school as a literacy assistant. Working with 6- and 7-year-olds had her radiant. She came home telling stories about the students, planning activities, studying new methodologies. "You know what is most beautiful, Edward? These children respect me, obey because they trust me, not because they are afraid. And when they do something wrong, I correct them with affection, and they understand." One day she arrived home particularly moved. "Edward, something happened today that made me think. There is a boy in my group, Johnny, who is very difficult. He hits his classmates, doesn't obey, throws tantrums. The teacher was almost giving up on him. And then I talked to him with patience. I tried to understand why he was acting like that. I discovered his parents are divorcing, that at home everything is very confused. I explained to him that the anger he felt for his parents couldn't be taken out on his classmates. It took time, but he understood. Today he brought me a drawing he made of me. Helen showed me the drawing. A female figure with a red skirt, brown hair, and a huge smile holding the hand of a small boy. "Helen, you are making a difference in those children's lives. Edward, I am teaching them what I didn't manage to teach Richard. That limits are necessary. That respect is mandatory. That people don't exist to serve us." That night, looking at my wife studying at the kitchen table, preparing activities for her students, I understood that our family tragedy had transformed into purpose. Helen wasn't just overcoming the pain of having lost her son. She was becoming a better person through that pain, and so was I. Some bridges, once burned, don't need to be rebuilt, even if you helped build them. Today, 2 years after that night that changed our lives forever, I can say that the Edward I became is a more complete man than the Edward who raised Richard. I am writing these words sitting on the porch of our house with Buddy sleeping at my feet and Helen preparing breakfast in the kitchen. It is just another Sunday morning, but there is a peace in this routine that didn't exist when we lived according to Richard's dramas. Helen is singing while she scrambles eggs in the pan. It is a song we learned together in the guitar classes we take now every Wednesday. She sings off-key as she always sang, but she sings without fear of being judged, without fear that someone will show up, saying she is making noise, or that she should get something more interesting to do. We don't know where Richard is. We heard he got a job in a big city, that he is trying to rebuild his life. We don't know if he learned anything from what happened, or if he is just waiting for an opportunity to return to the old patterns. Frankly, we don't care anymore. This might sound cruel to those who haven't lived what we lived. How can a father not care about his son? Some must be thinking, but there is a difference between not caring and not allowing yourself to be destroyed by the person you raised. For 33 years, Richard was the center of our lives. Everything we did, thought planned, was influenced by him. Our financial decisions depended on his needs. Our emotions depended on his mood. Our happiness depended on his approval. That is not love. That is emotional dependence disguised as paternal love. True love includes limits, includes saying no, includes protecting your own dignity, includes teaching consequences, includes the courage to let the other grow through the pain of their own decisions. Helen learned this the harder way than I did. As a mother, she had built her entire identity around motherhood. When Richard rejected her, she felt as if she had lost life's purpose. But little by little, she discovered that being a mother was just one of the things she is. She is also a wife, professional student, friend, citizen. She is also a complete person independent of her son. I, as a father, also had to deconstruct the idea that being a good father means accepting any behavior from the son. For years, I confused unconditional love with unconditional acceptance. I learned that loving unconditionally doesn't mean tolerating unconditionally. Richard always knew that regardless of what he did, we would be there to support him, to defend him, to solve his problems. That made him irresponsible, arrogant, cruel. Our own kindness became the fuel for his malice. When we finally set limits, when we finally said no, when we finally let him face the consequences of his own acts, he despaired. Not because he loved us and missed us, but because he had lost the people who were always available to solve his problems. The difference is subtle but fundamental. Helen receives letters from some of her former students, girls who already grew up and became women. They thank her for the teachings, for the patience, for the affection she showed when they were children. Aunt Helen, you were like a second mom to me, wrote one recently. It is ironic that Helen is remembered with affection by children she educated for a few years, while the son she raised with full-time dedication for 33 years treated her like a nuisance. This taught me that it is not the intensity of our love that determines how we will be treated. It is the quality of the limits we set. I also learned that there are losses that are actually liberations. Losing Richard not to death, but to the need for protection. It was painful, but it was also liberating. We stopped living. With fear, with tension, with constant guilt. Our life today is simple, but it is ours. We wake up when we want. We eat what we like. We spend our money on what makes us happy. We receive at home only people who respect us. It is a small life, perhaps, but it is a dignified life. Helen is specializing in special education. She wants to work with children who have learning difficulties. I want to help parents understand that educating is teaching limits with love. She says it isn't giving everything the child wants. I went back to doing volunteer engineering work. I helped the community build bridges, fix schools, plan drainage systems. It is rewarding to use my knowledge to solve real problems for people who really need it, instead of wasting energy trying to solve artificial problems created by someone who didn't want to be helped. People sometimes ask if we don't miss Richard, if we don't feel like looking for him trying a reconciliation. The answer is complex. We miss the boy he was, the young man we hoped he would become, the family we dreamed of having. But we don't miss the man he chose to become. We don't miss the humiliations, the manipulations, the constant stress. As for reconciliation, it would only be possible if Richard demonstrated genuine change, not just circumstantial regret. And genuine change takes years to prove. We are not willing to open our life again to someone who can hurt us again. Maybe that will change in the future. Maybe Richard really learns and grows. Maybe one day he will look for us. Not because he needs something, but because he finally understood the value of what he lost. If that happens, we will evaluate carefully. But our happiness no longer depends on that. Our life is not on hold waiting for him to improve. We move on. The most important lesson I learned is that being a father isn't a lifetime position of unrestricted acceptance. It is a responsibility to educate, protect, guide, and when necessary, Set hard limits, even if those limits include estrangement. There are many fathers and mothers out there living what we lived, being mistreated by ungrateful children, being used financially and emotionally, being humiliated in the name of family love. To those fathers and mothers, I want to say you don't owe your children anything beyond what you already lost during their upbringing. No, you are not obligated to accept disrespect. You are not obligated to support someone else's irresponsibility. You are not obligated to sacrifice your dignity to keep a family relationship that only exists on paper. Have the courage to say no. Have the courage to set limits. Have the courage to protect yourselves. You raised your children to be independent, not to be eternal parasites of your lives. And if they choose to walk away because you refuse to accept mistreatment, let them walk away. A family. That only exists at the expense of the humiliation of some members. Isn't a family. It is a prison. Today at 64, I am a man at peace. Helen at 60 is a fulfilled woman. We have projects, dreams, plans. We have a life worth living regardless of whether Richard is part of it or not. He will always be our son. But we finally went back to being complete people, not just his parents. And that for me is victory enough. If this story touched your heart, I want to know where you are watching us from. Right here in the comments, your city, your state, or even your country. Let me know this message reached you. And if you know a father or mother who is accepting less than they deserve from ungrateful children, share this video. Because there are many parents who need to understand that valuing oneself isn't selfishness, it is necessity. If this report made you reflect, leave a comment telling where you are watching us from. Write also what you felt listening to this story. Tell me, have you ever had to set rigid limits with children? And if this story made you think, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue following real stories of parents who chose their dignity. Because here we don't tell stories of victims. We tell stories of new beginnings, sending love from here in Chicago. And remember, did you build much more than a family? Did you build a man who deserves respect? How many times do we parents swallow the lack of respect in the name of peace? How many parents are financing their own humiliation? I learned at 64 that a father doesn't need to accept crumbs from someone who received a banquet of opportunities. That being a father doesn't mean being exploited. And that never, but never is it too late for a man to stand up and choose his own dignity. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this story with whoever needs to hear that limits are acts of self-love.